The meeting room was huge and filled with strange creatures from across the galaxy. Kyle Morrison sat in his chair and looked around. He was the only human in the room. All the other seats held aliens of different shapes and sizes. Some had scales, some had fur, and some looked like nothing Kyle had ever seen before. Kyle had been Earth's ambassador for only 3 months. This was his first big emergency meeting. He felt nervous but tried not to show it. His helper, Amy Peterson, sat next to him with her computer tablet. She was looking at information about why everyone was called here today. The leader of the meeting stood up. His name was Zrel, and he looked like a giant insect. He had a hard shell, and his mouth had moving parts that made clicking sounds when he talked. Zrel looked worried, which made Kyle feel more nervous. Zrel spoke in a loud voice so everyone could hear. He said that something terrible was happening. Creatures called the Vraken were attacking colonies on the edge of the galaxy. 3 colonies had stopped sending messages. Nobody knew if anyone there was still alive. Kyle leaned over to Amy and whispered to her. He asked what the Vraken were. He had never heard of them before. Amy touched her tablet and read the information. Her eyes got wide as she read. She told Kyle that the Vraken were the most dangerous hunters in the galaxy. No one had ever been able to stop them or fight them successfully. A big screen in the middle of the room turned on. It showed video from one of the colonies that was attacked. Kyle watched as a creature appeared on the screen. Many of the aliens in the room moved back in their chairs when they saw it. Some made scared sounds. The creature on the screen was huge. It stood as tall as 2 men. Its body was covered in black scales that seemed to eat the light around it. It had 6 arms and legs, and each one ended in sharp claws. Its head was long and narrow, and its mouth was full of teeth that looked like glass. But the scariest part was its eyes. It had 4 eyes that glowed and could see everything. Kyle watched the video and felt cold inside. The Vraken in the video walked up to a strong metal door. The door was made to protect people from attacks. The Vraken just pushed its claws into the metal and tore the door apart like it was made of paper. Inside, people were screaming and trying to run away. Zrel spoke again. He said that for 10,000 years no weapon had been able to stop the Vraken. People had tried shooting them with energy weapons that could burn through metal. The weapons would burn the Vraken's scales but not hurt them. People had tried shooting them with bullets and missiles. The bullets just bounced off their scales. People had tried using force fields and electric barriers. The Vraken learned how to break through them in seconds. Kyle raised his hand to speak. He asked if there was anything that worked against these creatures. Zrel shook his head slowly. Another alien named Dren spoke up. Dren looked like a lizard that walked on 2 legs. He said that Kyle was too young and his people were too new to understand. The Vraken were death itself. When they came to a place, the only thing to do was leave. Kyle felt angry. He asked if they were just supposed to run away. Should they abandon their homes and the people who lived there? Dren said yes. He said that running was better than dying. If they stayed and fought, everyone would die. The meeting continued for hours. Finally, they voted. Everyone except Kyle voted to evacuate and leave. 17 star systems would be abandoned. 2 of those systems had human colonies. The human settlements were called New Dakota and Riverside Colony. Thousands of people lived there. Now they would have to leave their homes. Kyle argued against the decision. He said there had to be another way. But Earth only had 1 vote, and it meant nothing against the votes of 46 other worlds. The decision was made. The colonies would be evacuated. When the meeting ended, Zrel walked over to Kyle. He spoke quietly so only Kyle could hear. He said he wanted to give Kyle some advice. Zrel had seen the Vraken hunt before. He had watched them destroy cities and kill millions of people. Evacuation was not about being afraid, he said. It was about surviving. Many great civilizations had been destroyed by the Vraken because they were too proud to run away. Kyle thanked Zrel for the advice but did not say anything else. He and Amy left the meeting room and went back to their ship. The ship was called Horizon's Edge. It was Earth's diplomatic vessel. As soon as they were on the ship, Kyle called Earth's military headquarters. He asked to speak with General Harrison Carter. The general was in charge of Earth's defense forces. Within a few minutes, the general's face appeared on the video screen. He looked old and tired, but his eyes were sharp. He told Kyle that he already knew about the evacuation order. Ships were being prepared to move everyone off the colonies. Kyle asked the general a question. He wanted to know if anyone had actually tried to fight the Vraken using normal fighting methods. Not just using advanced weapons, but actual combat. The general looked confused. He said that every military fight with the Vraken had been a disaster. The creatures were smart, fast, and almost impossible to hurt. Kyle asked another question. Had anyone tried fighting them hand-to-hand up close? The general stared at Kyle like he was crazy. He said that the Vraken were 12 feet tall and weighed over a ton. Fighting them up close would be suicide. A person would be torn apart in seconds. Kyle said maybe that was true, but he wanted to see one of these creatures with his own eyes before they gave up and left 2 colonies. He asked if they could send a team to watch the Vraken and study them. The general was quiet for a long time. Kyle could see him thinking about it. Finally, the general agreed. He said he would send Captain Lisa Bennett and a small team of soldiers. They would go and watch the Vraken from a safe distance. But the general made Kyle promise something. If Captain Bennett came back and said the creatures were as dangerous as everyone said, they would evacuate immediately. No more arguments. Kyle agreed to the promise. After the call ended, Kyle sat in his chair and thought. Amy brought him coffee and sat down across from him. She asked him what he was thinking. Kyle said he was not sure yet. Something about the whole situation felt wrong to him. The Vraken were dangerous, yes, but for 10,000 years no one had tried anything except running away or shooting at them. Maybe there was another way. Maybe they just had to find it. Amy nodded but looked worried. She hoped Kyle was right, because if he was wrong, a lot of people were going to die. Captain Lisa Bennett had been a soldier for many years. She had fought in wars on 3 different planets. She thought she knew what danger looked like. But the jungle moon called Epsilon 7 showed her a new kind of fear. Lisa and her team of 6 soldiers moved slowly through the thick jungle. The plants were tall and the air was hot and wet. Insects buzzed around their heads. Every sound made them jump. They were following a signal from a tracking device. 2 days ago, a Vraken had attacked a science station on this moon. The scientists had put a tracker on the creature before they escaped. Now Lisa's team was following it. Sergeant Danny Cole was walking in front of the group. He suddenly held up his hand, which meant everyone should stop and be quiet. He pointed ahead to an open area in the jungle. Lisa and the others crouched down and looked through the trees. In the clearing, the Vraken was eating. It had killed some kind of large animal and was tearing the meat apart with its claws and teeth. Lisa pulled out her camera and started recording. She watched the creature carefully, noting every detail. The Vraken was huge, even bigger than she expected. But it moved with grace and smoothness. Every movement had a purpose. Nothing was wasted. Nina Hayes was lying next to Lisa in the bushes. She was one of the best soldiers on the team. Nina whispered that the creature was beautiful in a scary way. Lisa understood what she meant. The Vraken was terrifying but also amazing to watch. Its black scales caught the light and seemed to change color slightly to match the shadows around it. The Vraken suddenly stopped eating. Its head turned toward where the team was hiding. Lisa held her breath and did not move. They were downwind, which meant the creature could not smell them. They were also hidden well in the bushes. After a few seconds, the Vraken went back to eating. Danny pointed at the creature's mouth. He whispered that they should watch how strong its jaws were. The Vraken bit through thick bones like they were nothing. The sound of breaking bone made everyone feel cold inside. They watched for 2 hours. The Vraken finished eating and then walked around the clearing. It seemed to be checking for danger. Lisa noticed that it took different paths each time it moved. It never did the same thing twice. This was not a stupid animal. This was an intelligent hunter that knew how to stay alive. Jake Foster was watching the motion sensors. These were devices that could detect movement in the jungle. He suddenly whispered that something was coming. Another creature was approaching from the other side of the clearing. A second Vraken came out of the trees. This one was smaller, probably younger. The 2 creatures looked at each other and started walking in circles. Lisa realized they were talking to each other. The sounds they made were too low for humans to hear, but Lisa's recording equipment could detect the vibrations in the air. The younger Vraken lowered its head and backed away from the dead animal. It was showing respect to the bigger one. The larger Vraken looked at the younger one for a moment, then made a gesture that seemed to give permission. The younger Vraken approached the food and started eating what was left. Lisa spoke quietly into her recorder. She said that the Vraken had a social system. They had rules about who was in charge and who had to follow. This was not mindless killing. These creatures had intelligence and culture. Suddenly, both Vraken stopped moving. Their heads snapped around and they stared directly at the spot where Lisa's team was hiding. They had been discovered. Danny said they needed to leave right away. The team got up and started moving back through the jungle as fast as they could. But the Vraken followed them. The creatures did not attack, but they stayed behind the team, tracking them through the trees. Lisa felt her heart beating fast. She realized something terrible. The Vraken were not just chasing them. They were pushing them in a certain direction. They were being herded like animals. The team ran into another clearing and stopped. In front of them were 3 more Vraken. They had been driven into a trap. The creatures had worked together to surround them. Lisa shouted for everyone to form a circle with their backs together. This way they could see in all directions. Everyone raised their weapons and waited. The 5 Vraken moved closer slowly. They were not in a hurry. They knew the humans could not escape. The biggest Vraken, the first one they had seen, walked forward. It looked at the humans with what seemed like curiosity. It tilted its head to one side as if trying to understand what they were. Then it raised one of its massive arms and brought its claws down toward Danny. Danny fired his plasma rifle. The weapon made a bright flash and a beam of energy hit the Vraken in the chest. The scales on its chest turned black from the heat, but the creature was not hurt. It did not even seem to feel pain. It just looked at Danny like nothing had happened. Nina said what everyone was thinking. Everything the council had told them was true. Their weapons could not hurt these creatures. They were going to die here. But Lisa was watching the Vraken's body language. The creature was not really attacking. It was testing them. It wanted to see what they would do. Lisa made a decision. She told everyone to stop shooting unless the Vraken actually tried to kill them. The soldiers lowered their weapons but kept them ready. The Vraken stood still watching the humans. The humans watched back. Nobody moved. The jungle was completely quiet except for the sound of insects and birds. 1 minute passed. It felt like an hour. Then something strange happened. The Vraken backed away. All 5 of them turned and walked back into the jungle. They disappeared into the trees and were gone. Jake asked why the creatures did not kill them. Nobody had an answer. The Vraken could have torn them apart easily, but they chose not to. Why? Lisa checked her equipment. Everything had been recorded and was already being sent back to the ship. Ambassador Morrison would see all of it. Maybe he could figure out what it meant. The team waited for 10 minutes to make sure the Vraken were really gone. Then they started the long walk back to their landing site. Everyone was quiet. They were all thinking about what had happened. They had been completely helpless, but they were still alive. When they got back to the ship, Lisa sent her report to Ambassador Morrison. She included all the video footage and her observations. She wrote that the Vraken were intelligent and used teamwork. They had a social structure with leaders and followers. Most importantly, they could have killed her team but chose not to. That meant something important, but Lisa did not know what. She ended her report with a warning. The Vraken were more than just dangerous animals. They were thinking beings with their own rules and culture. If humans wanted to survive in Vraken territory, they needed to understand these rules. Shooting at them would not work. They needed a different approach. But what that approach should be, Lisa had no idea. Ambassador Kyle Morrison watched Captain Bennett's video many times. Each time he watched it, he saw something new. The Vraken were not mindless killers. They were intelligent. They made choices. They let Lisa's team live when they could have easily killed them all. This meant something important. Kyle sat in his office with Amy. She was watching the video with him. Amy said that maybe the Vraken were testing the humans. Like a hunter checking out a new animal it had never seen before. Kyle nodded. That made sense. But it also meant that the Vraken could learn. They could change their behavior based on what they experienced. The evacuation of New Dakota Colony was happening fast. Ships were landing and taking people away from their homes. Families were crying as they packed their things. They had built houses and farms and businesses here. Now they had to leave everything behind because of creatures they had never even seen. Lieutenant Greg Palmer was in charge of security at the main spaceport. His job was to make sure everyone got on the ship safely and quickly. People were lined up at the transport ships carrying bags and boxes. Children were crying. Parents looked angry and scared. Greg walked back and forth checking on his security team. He called out to keep the lines moving. They needed everyone off the planet before the sun went down. That was when the Vraken usually hunted. Then someone screamed. The sound was full of pure terror. Greg turned and saw people running. His heart dropped into his stomach. A Vraken had gotten into the spaceport. The creature was moving fast, faster than something that big should be able to move. Security guards were shooting at it, but the weapons did nothing. The energy beams hit its scales and bounced off. The Vraken kept coming. It was heading straight toward a group of children who were waiting with their teacher near Transport 7. Greg did not think. He just ran. He put himself between the Vraken and the children. He had no plan. He knew his weapon would not work. He just knew that he could not let this thing reach those kids. The Vraken stopped 5 feet away from him. Up close, it was even more enormous than Greg had imagined. He had to bend his neck back to look at its face. The creature smelled strange, like metal and electricity. Its 4 eyes stared down at him. Greg could see his reflection in those glowing eyes. He looked very small. Behind him, one of the children was crying. It was a little girl named Sophie. She was scared and calling for her mother. The sound seemed to catch the Vraken's attention. It leaned down, bringing its terrible face close to Greg's. He could see its teeth. Each tooth was as long as his hand. Something broke inside Greg in that moment. It was not courage exactly. It was more like a reflex. Like when you tell a dog no when it is doing something bad. Greg raised his hand and slapped the Vraken across its snout. It was not a hard hit. Greg was not trying to hurt the creature. He could not hurt it even if he tried. It was just a quick smack, the kind you give to an animal that is getting too aggressive and needs to back off. Time seemed to stop. The whole spaceport went silent. Everyone stopped moving and stared. The Vraken pulled its head back. Its 4 eyes went wide. It made a sound that was half yelp and half cough. The creature looked shocked, if a giant alien predator could look shocked. Then the Vraken did something nobody expected. It lowered its head. It took several steps backward, away from Greg, away from the children, away from the transport ship. It moved to the edge of the spaceport and sat down. Just sat there on the ground, watching but not moving. Greg stood frozen. His hand was stinging from hitting the creature's scales. He could not process what had just happened. His brain could not understand it. Behind him, he heard one of the security guards trying to speak but unable to finish the sentence. The entire spaceport was silent. Hundreds of people stood still, watching the Vraken. The creature stayed where it was. It did not move toward them. It did not attack. It just sat and watched. 5 minutes passed. They felt like 5 hours. Then the Vraken stood up. It looked at Greg one more time. The look was strange. It was almost like respect. Then the creature turned and walked away into the forest. It disappeared among the trees and was gone. Greg finally let out his breath. He had not realized he was holding it. His legs felt weak and he almost fell down. Other security guards ran up to him asking if he was okay. Greg nodded but could not speak. The teacher gathered the children and rushed them onto the transport ship. Sophie looked back at Greg with wide eyes. She would remember this moment for the rest of her life. They all would. Within an hour, someone had recorded what happened on their phone. The video started spreading through human communication networks. Within a day, it had reached other human colonies. Within a week, it was being shown across the entire galaxy. Every species saw the same impossible thing. A human had slapped a Vraken, and the Vraken had backed down. The reaction was universal disbelief. Aliens from dozens of worlds said the video was fake. They said it was impossible. The Vraken did not back down from anything. They were apex predators. They killed everything they met. This could not be real. But more videos came in. Other people at the spaceport had recorded the incident from different angles. They all showed the same thing. Greg Palmer, a single human standing between a Vraken and children. The slap. The Vraken backing away and leaving. Kyle Morrison received the video while he was in a meeting with other ambassadors. He watched it 3 times before he believed what he was seeing. Then he called an emergency meeting with Earth scientists. If a simple slap could make a Vraken back down, there had to be a reason. They needed to understand what that reason was. Dr. Helen Martinez was Earth's top expert on alien life forms. She was called to analyze everything they knew about the Vraken. Kyle sent her all the videos. The footage from Lisa Bennett's team. The video of Greg Palmer. Every piece of information they had. Helen worked for days without sleeping. She watched the videos over and over. She studied how the Vraken moved, how they communicated with each other, how they reacted to different situations. Slowly, she began to see a pattern. The Vraken had rules. They had a social structure. And most importantly, they had a way of showing who was in charge. Helen watched the video of the two Vraken in the clearing. The way the larger one had made a gesture toward the smaller one. The way the smaller one had lowered its head and backed away. It was exactly what Greg Palmer had done. He had made a gesture of dominance. He had corrected the Vraken's behavior with a physical touch. And the Vraken had responded the same way it would respond to a more dominant member of its own species. Helen finished her analysis and sent it to Kyle. She included a detailed report explaining her theory. If she was right, everything would change. The galaxy would never be the same again. The Galactic Council chamber was packed. Every species wanted to hear what the human scientist would say. Dr. Helen Martinez stood at the front of the room with Ambassador Kyle Morrison beside her. She felt nervous with so many alien eyes watching her, but she kept her voice steady and calm. Helen began her presentation. She said that she had spent the last week studying every video and report about the Vraken. She believed she finally understood what happened at New Dakota. The large screen behind her showed images and videos as she talked. The first image showed a Vraken skeleton and body structure. Helen explained that the Vraken were apex predators. This meant they were at the top of the food chain on their home world. But their planet also had other dangerous predators. The Vraken had to compete with other deadly creatures. This shaped how they evolved and how they behaved. Helen showed the video from Captain Bennett's team. She pointed out the moment when two Vraken met in the clearing. The larger Vraken made a specific gesture toward the smaller one. It was a quick motion toward the face area. The smaller Vraken immediately lowered its head and backed away. This was not about fighting. This was about showing respect and knowing who was in charge. Commander Zrel interrupted. He said they already knew the Vraken had a social system with leaders and followers. This made them even more dangerous when they hunted in groups. How did this explain what happened with the human? Helen smiled. She said that was exactly the point. The Vraken's social system was based on dominance. But dominance was not shown through fighting to the death. It was shown through specific gestures and behaviors. She pulled up a close-up of the larger Vraken's gesture. It was a strike to the facial area that did not cause injury. It was a correction, not an attack. The room filled with whispers and clicking sounds as different species talked among themselves. Helen continued. She said that Lieutenant Palmer had instinctively copied this exact gesture. He performed the same motion that a dominant Vraken would use to correct a subordinate. The Vraken understood this gesture. To the creature, the human was acting like an alpha, like a leader. Ambassador Dren, the lizard-like alien who had argued against Kyle before, stood up. He said this was absurd. A human could not be dominant over a Vraken. Humans were tiny compared to Vraken. They were weak. How could the Vraken possibly see a human as dominant? Helen was ready for this question. She showed brain scans and behavioral data on the screen. She explained that in Vraken psychology, physical size was not the most important factor. What mattered was confidence and behavior. A Vraken alpha was not always the biggest. It was the one that showed the most confidence and the willingness to enforce rules. Helen played the video of Greg Palmer again. She pointed out his body language. He did not run away. He did not show fear. He stood his ground and placed himself between the Vraken and what he was protecting. Then he delivered the correction gesture. To a Vraken, this was alpha behavior. This was how a leader acted. Kyle leaned forward in his seat. He asked if this meant humans could control the Vraken. Helen shook her head. She said control was the wrong word. But humans could communicate with them using the Vraken's own social language. The key was confidence and understanding their signals. Vraken respected strength, but not the kind measured by muscles or weapons. They respected the strength of character and fearlessness. An alien from a species called the Telonis Collective spoke up. The Telonis were known for being very scientific and careful. The alien asked how they could test this theory without getting people killed. It was one thing to talk about it. It was another thing to prove it actually worked. Kyle said they already had volunteers. 3 human soldiers who had served with Lieutenant Palmer wanted to try making contact with a Vraken pack. With proper training and understanding of Vraken body language, they believed they could establish peaceful communication. The council debated for hours. Some species were excited about the possibility. Others were afraid. Some said it was too dangerous. Others said that if the humans were willing to risk their own people, they should be allowed to try. Finally, they voted. The council agreed to let the experiment happen. But there were conditions. It had to be done in a controlled environment. Scientists from multiple species would observe and record everything. If the attempt failed and people died, there would be no more experiments. Over the next 2 weeks, Helen worked with the 3 volunteers. Their names were Paul Rivera, Chris Donovan, and Betty Walsh. All 3 were experienced soldiers who were not easily frightened. Helen taught them everything she had learned about Vrakan behavior. She explained that eye contact was important. Looking away showed fear, but staring too aggressively could be seen as a challenge to fight. They had to find the balance. She taught them how to stand. Shoulders back, head up but not tense. Confident but not threatening. Most importantly, Helen taught them about the correction gesture. It was not a punch. It was not meant to hurt. It was a firm touch that said, "I am correcting your behavior because I have the authority to do so." The gesture had to be done with complete confidence. Any hesitation would be seen as weakness. Paul asked what would happen if they made a mistake. Helen was honest. She said they might be killed. The Vrakan were still dangerous predators. If they saw the humans as prey or as a threat instead of as dominant pack members, the humans would not survive. This was a risk they all understood. The experiment was scheduled to take place on the 4th moon of a planet called Centauri Beta. A Vrakan pack lived there. They had attacked a mining colony 6 months ago and the colony had been abandoned. The pack now considered that territory theirs. Ships from many different species gathered in orbit around the moon. Scientists and military observers watched from safe distances. The plan was simple. Paul would go alone first. If he survived the first contact, the others would join him. If Paul died, the experiment would end immediately. The night before the experiment, Kyle met with Paul privately. He told Paul that he did not have to do this. They could find another way. Paul smiled and said he wanted to do it. He had joined the military to protect people. If this worked, it could save millions of lives across the galaxy. It was worth the risk. Kyle asked Paul if he was scared. Paul said yes, he was terrified. But being brave did not mean not being scared. It meant doing what needed to be done even when you were scared. Kyle shook Paul's hand and wished him luck. That night, Helen could not sleep. She kept going over her research in her mind. What if she was wrong? What if she had misunderstood the Vrakan behavior? Tomorrow a man could die because of her theory. The weight of that responsibility was almost too much to bear. But it was too late to stop now. The experiment would happen in the morning. They would finally know if humans could really communicate with the galaxy's most feared predators. The answer would change everything one way or another. The morning sun was just coming up over the 4th moon of Centauri Beta. The landscape was rocky and barren. There were no trees, just stones and dust. Sergeant Paul Rivera stood alone in the middle of an open plain. He wore light armor but carried no weapons. His job was not to fight. His job was to communicate. Paul had been a soldier for 12 years. He thought he had conquered fear long ago, but standing here, waiting for the Vrakan to arrive, he discovered that fear still had power over him. His heart was beating fast. His hands were sweating inside his gloves. He took deep breaths and tried to calm down. Dr. Helen Martinez was in an observation bunker 2 miles away. The bunker was underground and protected by thick walls. She was watching Paul through cameras and monitoring his vital signs on her computer. She could see that his heart rate was elevated. She spoke to him through his earpiece. Helen reminded Paul to keep his posture confident. He should make eye contact with the Vrakan. He should not make sudden movements unless he was establishing boundaries. Paul responded that this was easy for her to say since she was safe in the bunker. But his tone was light. He was joking to deal with his fear. The Vrakan appeared from behind a rock formation. There were 5 of them moving together. Paul recognized the behavior from Helen's training. This was a hunting pack with a clear leader. The alpha would be the biggest one in front. The largest Vrakan walked toward Paul until it was about 10 feet away. Then it stopped and studied him. Paul forced himself to stand tall and straight. Every instinct in his body was screaming at him to run or to fight. But he did neither. He just stood still and looked at the creature. The Vrakan tilted its massive head to one side. It was examining Paul like a puzzle it was trying to figure out. Paul stared back, meeting the creature's 4 glowing eyes. Helen had taught him not to look away. Looking away would signal fear or submission. Paul needed to show that he was confident and unafraid. The Vraken took one step closer. It was testing Paul to see what he would do. Paul did not move. He did not back up. He did not raise his hands defensively. He just stood his ground and kept eye contact. Another step. Now the Vraken was so close that Paul could feel the heat coming from its body. He could smell that strange metallic scent that all Vraken had. The creature was enormous up close. Its scales were like black glass. Its claws could tear him apart in seconds. Paul was very aware of how fragile his body was compared to this creature. The Vraken lowered its head until it was at Paul's eye level. They were face to face now. Paul could see his reflection in the creature's eyes. He looked small and weak, but he did not let that show in his posture or expression. He thought about Lieutenant Greg Palmer facing down a Vraken to protect children. If Greg could do it, so could he. This was the moment Helen had described. The challenge point. The moment when the Vraken would decide if Paul was dominant or if he was prey. Paul raised his right hand slowly and deliberately. He did not make any fast movements. He moved his hand toward the Vraken's face. The creature could have bitten his hand off or struck him with its claws. But it did not move. It just watched. Paul placed his hand on the side of the Vraken's face. It was not a slap. It was a firm, steady touch. The gesture said, "I see you and I acknowledge you and I am not afraid of you." Paul held his hand there for several seconds. The Vraken went completely still. Its four eyes stared at Paul with an intensity that was almost overwhelming. Paul could feel the creature's intelligence. This was not a stupid animal. This was a thinking being trying to understand what Paul was doing. Then slowly the Vraken leaned into Paul's hand. It pressed the side of its face against Paul's palm. It was accepting the gesture. It was acknowledging Paul's dominance. In the observation bunker, Helen whispered in amazement. She could not believe what she was seeing. It was working. Her theory was correct. Paul slowly withdrew his hand. The Vraken straightened up and stepped back. It made a deep rumbling sound that came from somewhere in its chest. The other four Vraken in the pack approached. They were no longer moving in a hunting formation. Now they seemed curious, almost friendly. Over the next hour, Paul interacted with all five Vraken. Each one tested him in different ways. One would suddenly move toward him quickly. Another would make a loud, aggressive sound. Each time Paul responded with calm confidence. He did not show fear. He did not attack. He simply stood his ground and corrected their behavior when needed. By the end of the hour, the smallest Vraken was following Paul around like a puppy. When Paul sat down on a rock to rest, the young Vraken sat beside him. It was almost comical, this massive, deadly creature sitting next to a human like they were friends. Paul spoke into his communicator. He told Helen that he thought they had just made friends with the galaxy's most dangerous predators. His voice was full of wonder and relief. He was alive. The experiment had worked. The video footage was presented to the Galactic Council the next day. Kyle Morrison stood before the assembly with a confidence he had not felt before. The video showed Paul interacting with the Vraken pack. It showed the creatures accepting him, following him, even showing what appeared to be affection. Kyle spoke to the council. He said that for 10,000 years, they had run from the Vraken because they saw them only as monsters. They tried to fight them with weapons. They tried to overpower them with force. But humans understood something that the other species had missed. Humans had lived alongside dangerous predators on Earth. They had turned wolves into dogs. They had learned to live with lions and bears and sharks. They understood that apex predators were not evil. They were not monsters. They were intelligent beings with their own rules and social structures. Kyle explained that dominance was not about violence. It was about respect and understanding. The Vraken were not unstoppable. They had been waiting for species that were brave enough to communicate with them on their own terms. They did not need to be defeated. They needed to be understood. Commander Zrel stood up. His voice was shaking slightly. He asked if Kyle was saying that all the death and destruction, all the evacuations and fear had been unnecessary. All the civilizations that had been destroyed by the Vraken could have been saved if they had just tried to communicate. Kyle chose his words carefully. He said that the fear was not unreasonable. It was based on real evidence. Thousands of people had died. The caution was understandable. But yes, he believed that most Vraken attacks had happened because other species treated them as mindless beasts to be destroyed, rather than intelligent beings to be respected. Over the following months, human specialists worked with Vraken packs across many star systems. The results were remarkable. Attacks dropped dramatically. Several Vraken packs even began cooperating with human colonies. They helped defend against space pirates and dangerous animals. They became protectors rather than threats. The Vraken, it turned out, were just as frustrated with other species as those species were with them. They were territorial and required respect. But once that respect was established, they were loyal. They remembered kindness and they returned it. 1 year after the incident at New Dakota, everything had changed. The colonists had returned to their homes. The evacuation ships that had been prepared were never used. Instead, the spaceport became a place where humans and Vraken met peacefully. Captain Lisa Bennett, who had first observed the Vraken in the jungle, wrote a report about everything that had happened. She said that they went looking for a way to kill monsters and found intelligent beings instead. Sometimes the greatest victories came not from destruction but from understanding. The Vraken did not need to be defeated. They needed to be acknowledged. Lieutenant Greg Palmer became famous across the galaxy. He received medals and honors from Earth's government. Reporters wanted to interview him constantly. They all asked the same question. What was he thinking when he slapped the Vraken? Greg always gave the same answer. He said he was thinking about his mother. She had raised 5 children by herself. When the kids misbehaved, she would give them a look and sometimes a quick smack on the hand. It was not meant to hurt them. It was meant to say that's enough and you need to stop. It was correction, not punishment. He had treated the Vraken the same way he would treat a child who needed to be told no. The reporters found this funny. One reporter said that Greg had saved humanity by treating a massive alien predator like a misbehaving child. Greg laughed and agreed. When you put it that way, it did sound ridiculous. But sometimes the most complicated problems had the simplest solutions. You just had to be brave enough to try them. The Galactic Council officially changed how they classified the Vraken. They were no longer listed as an existential danger. The new classification was potential ally species requiring specialized contact protocols. Human diplomats began training members of other species in Vraken communication techniques. It was noted that humans seemed to have a special talent for working with Vraken. Maybe this was because human history was filled with examples of taming dangerous creatures. On Earth, humans had turned wild animals into companions through patience and respect rather than through force. Kyle Morrison wrote a final report to Earth's government. He said that humans had entered the galactic community as the youngest species. They were the least experienced and the most naive. But sometimes fresh eyes could see solutions that ancient wisdom had overlooked. The other species saw only teeth and claws when they looked at Vraken. They saw monsters that needed to be avoided or destroyed, but humans saw pride and intelligence. They saw potential friends who simply needed to be approached correctly. In the end, humanity did not defeat the Vraken through violence or superior weapons. They understood them, and understanding turned out to be far more powerful than any weapon. This was the gift humanity brought to the galaxy. Not advanced technology or military might, but the belief that understanding could triumph over fear. 5 years passed. New Dakota Colony held a celebration every year on the anniversary of the day they were almost evacuated. They called it Founders Day. It commemorated the day the colony nearly died, but instead became the birthplace of a new kind of relationship between species. Greg Palmer, now a captain, attended the celebration. Walking beside him was a Vraken named Krath. Krath was the same individual that Greg had slapped 5 years ago. The two had formed a friendship that nobody could have predicted. Krath became a guardian and protector of the colony. He also became Greg's closest companion. Children ran past them, laughing and playing. Some of the children were playing with young Vraken, who had been born after the alliance was formed. These young Vraken had grown up with humans as friends. They knew no other way. A new generation was being raised where humans and Vraken were not enemies but neighbors. A teenage girl approached Greg and Krath. Her name was Sophie. She was the child who had been crying that day at the spaceport when the Vraken first appeared. She was 15 years old now. She had made a banner for the celebration and wanted to show it to them. The banner had a painting of a human hand reaching toward a Vraken. The image showed the gap between the two species being bridged by courage and understanding. Below the image were words, "Courage builds bridges." Greg felt his throat tighten with emotion. He told Sophie that the banner was perfect. She smiled and then did something that showed how much had changed. She walked up to Krath and placed her small hand on his massive leg. The Vrakan lowered his enormous head so she could reach his face. Sophie patted his snout gently. She told Krath thank you for being their friend. Krath made the low rumbling sound that humans had learned meant happiness and contentment. To hear this sound from a creature that was once considered the most dangerous in the galaxy was still amazing to everyone who witnessed it. Kyle Morrison and Amy Peterson stood on a hill overlooking the colony. They watched the celebration below. Humans and Vrakan were together, sharing food and stories. Two species that had been on the edge of war were now living in peace. Amy asked Kyle if he ever thought about how close they came to giving up. How close they came to just evacuating and running away like the council wanted. Kyle said he thought about it every day. If they had followed the fear, if Greg had not been brave enough to try something different, none of this would exist. Amy mentioned that other species were now making contact with Vrakan too. They were following the protocols that humans had developed. Some were successful. Others still struggled because they could not overcome their fear. But progress was being made across the galaxy. Kyle smiled. He said the galaxy was big enough for all of them. They just needed to remember that being different did not mean being dangerous. Being strange did not mean being an enemy. Every species had something valuable to offer. The Vrakan offered strength and loyalty. Humans offered empathy and the willingness to see past appearances. A young Vrakan ran past them, chasing a ball that a human child had thrown. Its parent followed at a slower pace, nodding respectfully to Kyle as it passed. 5 years ago, this scene would have been impossible to imagine. Now it was normal life in the colony. Kyle said that the best part of the whole situation was how they solved it. They did not need advanced technology or powerful weapons. They solved it with something humans had always had: empathy and the courage to reach out and make contact. The willingness to see the person behind the monster. As the sun set over New Dakota, the sounds of celebration filled the air. There was laughter from both humans and the rumbling sounds from Vrakan. It was the sound of understanding, of bridges built across differences, of courage rewarded. The story of how humanity made peace with the Vrakan spread across the galaxy. It became a lesson taught in schools and academies. The lesson was simple but powerful. Fear can be overcome with understanding, and the greatest strength is not the ability to destroy but the ability to connect. The Vrakan had not been defeated by humanity. They had been welcomed, and in being welcomed, they became some of humanity's strongest allies and most loyal friends. The galaxy was forever changed, not by force but by the simple power of an open hand and an open heart. In the archives of the Galactic Council, the footage remained. A single human protecting children, meeting a massive predator without fear and delivering a message through the simplest gesture. A slap that said, "I see you and I respect you and I am not afraid." That moment changed history. It proved that understanding was more powerful than weapons, that courage was more valuable than strength, that sometimes the answer to the biggest problems was not complexity, but simplicity, not destruction but connection. The galaxy learned that day that humans brought something special to the stars, not because they were stronger or smarter than other species, but because they refused to see enemies where friends might stand. Because they believed that every intelligent being deserved a chance to be understood before being judged. That belief, that simple human belief, made all the difference.